So, you want to defend the Second Amendment, but maybe you're not sure the very best way to do so. Well, luckily in this video, I'm going to share with you just a handful of tips that I promise you will help next time you find yourself defending arguably our most important right. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Victor Nieves. I am a political content creator, a radio show host, and the author of the soon-to-be published book, Conservative Prudence. And I have spent way too much time debating, particularly the Second Amendment. So I know that there are millions of strategies that people may have, but in my experience, this has been what has worked the absolute best. All right, so tip number one, I've got a list. Tip number one is to know your audience. That is arguably the best piece of advice I could possibly give to conservatives when debating any political topic, but especially the Second Amendment. And you may think, Victor, what are you talking about? Know your audience. Of course I know my audience, but far too many people, they don't distinguish between if they're having a honest person-to-person conversation with maybe a friend, a family member, a coworker. You have to treat those three different than if, for example, you were Ben Shapiro on a big debate stage in front of 7,000 people. You're going to conduct yourself and you're probably going to format your argument a little bit different because your objectives are different and your audience is different. So tip number one, very straightforward, very simple, but know your audience. The second piece of advice I have to you is to get straight to the point. Don't get lost in the weeds with all of the millions of different little arguments that are surrounding the Second Amendment. Just get straight down to the point of it, that the intent and purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect us, the people, from tyranny in whatever form it may present itself as, whether foreign or domestic. It could be our own government. That's the whole purpose of the Second Amendment. It's not about hunting. It's not about even a burglar, although hunting is great. Hunting is awesome. And the ability to protect yourself from a burglar is definitely a good side factor. It's a good side result of the Second Amendment. But the Founding Fathers, when they wrote it, they weren't worried about white-tailed deer. They weren't worried about ducks. And truthfully, matter-of-factly, they really didn't write it about burglars, carjackers, or self-defense out on the street. The real reason that we have enshrined in our Constitution the right to keep and bear arms is to protect ourselves, the people, from a tyrannical government. You may think that that sounds a little bit radical or extreme to have firearms to protect yourself from your own government, but that's okay. Our founding fathers were a little bit radical and extreme. The Second Amendment itself is a little bit radical and extreme. In fact, it was the first of its kind. Nowhere in history had the people ever reserved the right to arm themselves in defense against their own government. But to illustrate the importance of being armed against your own government, I used to often ask people this while President Trump was still in office. I would say, okay, you don't like President Trump. You think he's a madman. You think he's crazy. Well, assume that tomorrow, Donald Trump, or whatever president it may be at the time, Donald Trump decides that he's going to go before a joint session of Congress or maybe the Supreme Court and say, it's been huge, it's been good, but go home. I'm done. Bigly, we don't need you anymore. You can go home. And by the way, your Bill of Rights, your First Amendment, it's gone. I've decided it's gone. Right? What would happen if some leader of the United States decided that he was going to unilaterally just disband Congress or maybe get rid of the Supreme Court? Well, assuming that the military was on his side with this one, what would happen? Well, an unarmed population could literally do nothing about it. If that happened anywhere else in the world where they do not have the ability to protect themselves with firearms, they're just at the mercy of the government. But if that happened here in the United States, me and a couple million other gun-toting redneck radicals would drive to DC and we would fix that problem. You understand what I'm saying? So people sometimes don't grasp that human nature is evil, and there is a possibility that our own government at some point down the line becomes tyrannical, becomes evil. Even in a so-called democratic system of government, evil is very possible. Don't forget, Hitler was legally and democratically elected prior to the Holocaust. Democratic governments can indeed become tyrannical hellholes. And the final check and balance against that we have here in the United States that's so radical and extreme is our Second Amendment. It is our right, our ability to protect ourselves, to be armed against tyranny in whatever form it may come, whether that's Red Dawn or whether that's the United States having a tyrannical, crazy, evil dictatorship rise up from within, foreign and domestic, right? There's a reason that we have our Second Amendment. And arguing any of these little tertiary reasons, any other, which there's a lot of good supporting information, there's a lot of good supporting reasons to have the Second Amendment, like hunting, like self-defense. But at the end of the day, I find that the best, most effective argument for the Second Amendment has always been and will always be to argue from the intent and purpose of the Second Amendment. Next tip I have for you, and we already kind of touched on this within tip number 2, but is to use historical evidence to back you up. Never expect anyone to just take your word for it. That's not smart. Never take anyone's word for it, myself included. If you hear me say something in a video, don't just assume it to be true. Look it up. So encourage people to do that, but use historical evidence. For example, I discussed the Revolutionary War. That's the reason, right? The reason for the season. That's the reason that we have the Second Amendment here in the United States. We had a Revolutionary War where we quite literally had to fight off a tyrannical government. To assume that that couldn't happen again is ignorant. You could also encourage people to think, just critically think, what are the worst things that have ever happened in human history? Well, almost all of them, from the Holocaust, etc., almost all of them have been committed by a government against their own people. There's even a term for it. They refer to this as democide. It's the government killing of an unarmed people. There is an abundance of historical evidence that supports the need, the reason that we have the Second Amendment. The intent and purpose is backed up very strongly by historical evidence, and not only just historical evidence, but in actual letters from our founding fathers where they clearly lined out, this is why we came up with the Second Amendment. This is the reason that we have a Second Amendment, is because we literally just fought off a whole tyrannical government. The superpower of the time was defeated by a bunch of revolutionaries that happened to have been well armed. I got one more tip for you, and it's sort of a bonus tip that applies, again, to every aspect of political discourse, but this is to know your opponent's position, know their arguments and their point of view as well, if not better, than they do. And when you know their arguments as well or better than they do, it's almost like playing chess with somebody, but you already know what moves they're going to make before they make them, and you can just easily counter. That applies to every single aspect in all of politics, but in the Second Amendment debate scene, that would apply to certain statistics. That might apply to certain, emotionally charged arguments regarding whether it's children or schools or etc. Know those things like the back of your hand and have an appropriate response prepared for all of them. That's all I got for you today, folks. Hopefully these tips help you, and as always, please keep me in your prayers, keep your country in your prayers, and I will see you all next time. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe. If you happen to like this foreign and domestic 1776 shirt, I'll be sure to drop a link in the comment section here where you can find one of those. But y'all take care and God bless.